Okay, so it's the middle of the night, and I'm recording this because I had an inspiration from Jehovah, to continue my life story for the benefit of my children, seeing as the times that are coming up are going to be very difficult and already are very pressing. Full stop. If I say full stop, it's because I'm so used to dictating because I am blind. So I'm not a perfect man, but I enjoy the pursuit of perfection, and especially the perfection that comes from Jehovah through his son, Yehoshua. Now, when I was a young man of 16, my interests were wide and varied, and I couldn't choose which of the O-level subjects I was taking were my favorite, or which one was my favorite. However, I had the general direction of becoming an unbelieving scientist when I was brought up short by circumstances which left me without any education for about 6 months. As it turned out, I was too bright for the local schools and had to wait for a place in the local grammar school. Now, this was down in London, and my uncle Elisha, who I have just recently designated as my favourite uncle for memory reasons, was a very pious man, but also he looked into every kind of religious doctrine and pamphlet as he studied the Bible. And he also believed that he was a prophet based on his name and on his experiences. And he wrote quite a bit, but where his writings are, I don't know. And I don't know whether his family preserved them. But he used to write in triplicate. He used to write and have underneath it carbon copying paper, and what he wrote would be impressed on 2 sheets below. So this was the kind of pious man that he was, and he believed that he was receiving inspiration, and he probably was, but I was not in that particular time interested in the biblical understanding of things. I was more into science and physics and atomic bombs. And that was really what attracted me to the magazine called The Plain Truth, which was produced by the Worldwide Church of God, because I thought it was a glossy magazine, a bit like Scientific American, which was going to deal with nuclear physics. Imagine my surprise when it turned out to be dealing with the quote-unquote Bible and biblical prophecies and the application of the Bible, that old and ancient and quaint book to my daily modern life at that time. There were things that they pointed out that were in the Bible that for some reason or other my parents hadn't pointed out to me. I suppose they generally thought, along with everybody else, that we were all going to heaven if we were good, and to hell if we weren't. But I had no real concept of heaven or hell, and no real fear of these things because they were not scientific. However, the plain truth, first of all, completely trashed the idea of going to heaven and going to hell, and the idea of a soul, and any other religious idea that I might have grown up with and absorbed without even thinking about. And the way that they did it was a way which was very agreeable to me as a scientist. They did it logically. And even though I didn't know what logic was, I appreciated systematic approaches. And this magazine was based on a systematic approach to understanding and studying the Bible. And moreover, they wrote in modern English, even though they quoted King James English. So, needless to say, I was entranced, and then I was able to make some little tests of my own which convinced me that this was the way to go. And so I decided, after having seen the biblical proof for Shabbat as the day on which we should worship Jehovah and rest, that I had to show my commitment, my new commitment to Jesus as it was at that time, and God as it was at that time, by giving up my Saturday job, which I'd only had for 3 weeks, and starting to keep the Shabbat. Well, keeping the Shabbat, apart from the self-righteous justification for doing it, was quite boring to start off with, and I filled the time by reading loads and loads and acquiring loads and loads of material from the Worldwide Church of God. But this was not sufficient, and I soon came into contact with a minister, Barry Bourne, with regard to taking it further. But prior to that, I had attended, I think, the local Baptist church for one of their altar call meetings. And I don't know why I did that, except for I was walking by the church and I felt drawn to go in. I went in and sat down at the back, thinking to myself, they're all wrong. They've got it wrong. And this was due to my new knowledge. But then, when the minister said, if you want to show that you are on the side of Jesus, you need to stand up and come down to the front, I was convicted that I couldn't, in that company, stay sat down. So I got up and I walked to the front. And this was a demonstration to the community that was in the church that I was convicted to Jesus, but not to that church. And when I looked over his shoulder, I could see that there was a back door where I could escape. So at the end of the service, when he called all those other people that followed after me down to the altar, into the back room, I shot out the back door and cleared off home. And I remember my uncle coming to me saying that he got a word from this local minister, who happened to be a Baptist minister, saying that he thought that I was confused and that I should return and he would help sort me out. But I wasn't confused, because I said directly to my uncle, they do not keep the Shabbat, so why would I want to associate with them? So my next goal was to associate with people who kept the Shabbat. And this occurred when I was in Lincoln doing my A-levels. And I finally got invited down to London to the Worldwide Church of God campus down there called Ambassador College, where I attended my first Passover and unleavened bread services. And I made my way down there by train by myself, and booked a hotel by myself. Went to the Shabbat service for the first time and met some wonderful and lovely people. Went home and came back, and then was asked where I was the night before. I said I went home. And they said, well, did you not go to the night to be much observed? And I said, I've never heard of such a thing. So I was at the first day of unleavened bread, which I had heard of. And we were having some wonderful, inspiring speakers, but I can remember the incredible New York cheesecake that came out at lunchtime. And I don't think that I was converted by it, but very nearly. So after I'd attended those services, Mr. Bourne invited me to attend local services, and in those days, local meant Leeds. And he contacted a local person who lived in Lincolnshire, but he lived in Horncastle area. And he duly turned up on the Shabbat, took me in his car to Leeds, and I started to associate with the Sabbath-keeping Worldwide Church of God congregations in that area. So that is how I began my study of Jesus and God. And I did so, as I did all studies, with great enthusiasm, and I wanted to learn the Hebrew and the Greek and the verses in the Bible which related to the things that I was really interested in. I needed to understand some very big, imprecise words like righteousness and salvation and justification. So I spent my time looking into these words in what was called a concordance, and I think it was Young's Literal Concordance, which I bought. And that enabled me to take the King James English and find a Hebrew word, and then the understanding of it from the point of view of young, which was quite literal. And this suited my mind. I am a very literal person. But I started to find that the King James Version was misleading me, and I wanted a more modern translation. And looking at the different modern translations, I wanted one without the these and the thous, and one that didn't try and convince me that I had a soul. And the only one that I could find, which I enjoyed because of its quirkiness, was the New World Translation. So I started to do my studies with the New World Translation and the Young's Literal Concordance, and some books on how to learn Hebrew and how to learn Greek. And that's how I spent my next 13 or so years. I advanced in terms of getting more detailed concordances. Strong's Exhaustive Concordance was the one that I ended up with. I also advanced in terms of reading through the course on the Greek endings, and a little bit on the Hebrew, which was very strange. So I was more or less directed towards the Greek, because it being a, quote, Christian, unquote, church, they viewed things from the perspective of the so-called New Testament. But they were thoroughly grounded in the Old Testament, quote, unquote, and advanced many of their doctrines from the Old Testament, and showed how they continued into the so-called New Testament era. So what I wanted to say was that I was fed a carefully packaged diet by the Worldwide Church of God. It was carefully packaged and arranged so that, being a logical person, I could logically come to the conclusion that there was a God, that the Bible was His word, that it was a manual for life, and that it was needed to be studied diligently every day if I wanted to achieve my incredible human potential, which turned out to be not going to heaven, but being a king in the kingdom of God. Well, I was fed this diet and I lapped it up. But I didn't just eat the diet and not investigate it, because that's not the package that I was given. The package was that everything had to be proved by me from the scriptures. So I was diligent in doing that and comparing my results with the results which were either given in the plain truth or the good news, or I was directed to. And there was great comfort in the fact that we agreed. However, as time went on, and as I became more familiar with the consensus view of the church and Mr. Armstrong, I became aware that there were differences that needed to be explained, and that there was also a process for which these differences could be looked at as a body in order to maintain unity, and through which we would then come to a united and hopefully divine conclusion. So everything seemed to be catered for, except for the fact that there was no response to these questions that showed that they were actually listening to those differences that not only I was pointing out, but other members of the church were pointing out. We were always told the question is being looked at, it's gone up, let's concentrate on what we do understand, and we'd have a Bible study based on the current doctrine, and we'd be waiting for some new insight to come down. And often that new insight would appear either in the Worldwide News, which is another membership newspaper to keep everybody up to date with what was going on with the Great Commission. And it was and is a great commission that Mr. Armstrong was able to achieve with the help of the loyal and devoted members of the Worldwide Church of God. And we also found that the Good News would update things, and also the Plain Truth would update things. So there was movement in the understanding of the church, and that was always a good sign. But there was also a reluctance to look at the plain alternative understanding that presented itself. Well, each person personally has to stand before Jehovah and give an account. And I got to the stage where I knew that I had to do something. It happened when Mr. Armstrong died, and the great engine of the commission and also of the investigation into the truth behind the King James Version was being dismantled by those that followed him. That Jehovah brought me into contact with my wife, and I had several practical decisions to make, and one of them was to leave the church to follow the understanding that Jehovah was giving me with regard to the wind-like entities and the decontaminating wind, which he made available to all his servants. So, when I left the fellowship of the church and I was given the responsibility to look after the young lady who became my wife, it enabled me then to explore many of the things more fully in the context of a family situation in the real world. And that is where a lot of my theological training was challenged and had to be replaced by practical daily experience of surviving and living and understanding the writings and the concepts in my daily life in modern terms. And I can't say I did that perfectly, and I can't say that I always put Jehovah first, because it was a difficult balance between family commitments, what I thought the scriptures were saying, what I understood was not correct, the influence of the religious establishment, the philosophical nature of many of the concepts that I had been given, which did not in any way measure up to the scientific information that I was learning. The disconnect between the spiritual, quote unquote, and the material, quote unquote. Just so many different things that I needed to unlearn and relearn. And it was an intense time for me. Intense enough to isolate me, I suppose, from the normal theological seminaries and development, and put me into a process of rigorous self-examination and study, and making ad hoc decisions along the way with my wife and children and growing family, and the relationships that I was having, which were forming and breaking with some religious people and some people who were now available to me online. So what I'm trying to say is that I wasn't perfect, I am not perfect, but Jehovah, God as he was to start off with, Elohim as Mr. Armstrong directed us to, was the central focus of my life and study. And when I had exhausted all that I could, going into different languages to understand Elohim, I was moved on to try and understand Jehovah, or YHWH. And then after years of studying YHWH, only when I had come to the full understanding of the magnetic universe and the electric universe, was I able then to sit back and review everything. And it was then that Yehoshua came back into my conscious mind and life, and began this next stage in my life. So during those years, I was studying. I think my wife said I made my religion up as I went along, and I could agree with that to a certain extent from the outside. But the wind that was decontaminating and instructing me has always been the same wind. And it has given me courage and strength, and now opportunity to bring to you the good news of your incredible human potential.